Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the first Book at Lunchtime event of this Hillary Term 2023. My name is Maria Blanco, and I'm the Academic Champion for Networks and Partnerships at Torch. Normally, it's Wes Williams, our director, who introduces these events, but I'm really happy to act on his behalf. He's returning from India. And I'm also in the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages, which means that I am these people here are my dear colleagues, and Magdalena, I love your work, as I just told you. So today we are discussing this wonderful book, After Clarice, Reading Lispector's Legacy in the 21st Century. A word about the Torch Book at Lunchtime series first. These gatherings are some of our longest standing flagship events, and we have films of every featured book discussion dating back to 2013, which is like already prehistory. So Book at Lunchtime has a growing history and heritage. The podcast and videos of all of our previous discussions are a popular feature of our website and also our YouTube channel, and we have been privileged to feature an astonishing variety of books and authors over the years. So please do visit our YouTube channel to see more. And indeed, today's discussion will be published on the YouTube channel very soon, so watch out for that. We have a wonderful lineup of discussions at all our Book at Lunchtime events in Hillary and Trinity Term. And another way that you can stay in touch and connected is to sign up for the Torch newsletter. So just go to the Torch website. Right, and today we are absolutely delighted to welcome Adriana Jacobs and Claire Williams, who are the co-editors of After Clarice. This is a groundbreaking volume on one of Brazil's most powerful and inventive authors. This work brings together scholars, authors, and artists, and also translators working in a wide range of languages and disciplines to address Lispector's place as a Brazilian writer in 21st century configurations of world literature. The volume explores, for example, Lispector's status as a Jewish writer, as well as issues of identity, class, race, gender, and sexuality, all of which abound in her work. It also examines the politics of publishing and marketing Lispector for international readerships. So I'm going to introduce Adriana and Claire very briefly. Adriana Jacobs is an associate professor and Cowley lecturer in modern Hebrew literature and a fellow of the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. Claire Williams is an associate professor of Brazilian literature and culture and a fellow of St. Peter's College. Our panelists are Book at Lunchtime veteran, Professor Patrick McGuinness from French. He's also a writer, an actor, and a translator. Magdalena Edwards is a translator who has contributed to the book and indeed wrote one of the chapters, I believe it's chapter 21, The Body Speaks. So we look forward to an excellent and wide-ranging discussion today, and I now will hand over to Patrick, who will be chairing today's panel.
Thank you very much. So one of the reasons I agreed with pleasure to facilitate or chair this session this afternoon was because I found this book not just very comprehensive, as it has to be at over 450 pages, but incredibly exciting and fresh and full of different ways of thinking, not just about Lispector's work, but about how we engage with literature. So that was what drew me to it first of all. And having perused the contents, I also got the sense that it was like some kind of intellectual piñata, albeit a structured one, from which tumble all kinds of new ways of thinking about what we read, about how we read it, how we're entitled to respond to it too. And I found especially exciting, actually, the way in which it laid emphasis upon the creative, not just in the obviously creative writing, the poetic and the prose writing in this book, but creative criticism and the creativity that is inherent in criticism. So I think the shape of this afternoon really is that I will invite the readers, the panelists, first of all to read from the book, and then I will bring in some questions to which they will respond. Maddie, you already introduced them, so I think we can pass straight to the moment where I invite you to read from the book. I don't know what order you would like to do that from.
Claire and I will read from the introduction, and then we'll hand it over to Magdalena.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. It's a real honour to be part of this series of Book at Lunchtime in its 10th year, and a great way to start the new term and the new year. So I'm going to read from the beginning of the introduction, and I think Adriana will read from towards the end of the introduction. There's plenty in between, but we're not going to go through every summary of every chapter. You have to read the book. There's actually something for you. So our introduction is entitled Afterthoughts and Afterwords. After, the Oxford English Dictionary tells us, is a very versatile word. It can be a noun, an adjective, a preposition, a conjunction, an adverb, and a prefix. It can indicate both time, place, manner, and order, denoting one specific event occurring in immediate succession to another, or everything subsequent. And it can even give a sense of the future. Those following after may be in pursuit of something or in search of it, awaiting or resulting from it, in accordance with, in imitation or memory of it, or even resembling it. Our book, After Clarice, Reading Lispector's Legacy in the 21st Century, echoes the multiple meanings and functions of this kaleidoscopic term in the way it addresses the legacies of the life and works of Ukrainian-born, naturalized Brazilian writer Clarice Lispector, born 1920, died 1977, one of the great Latin American writers of the 20th century. Chronologically, its contributions discuss the publishing history, critical fortunes, growing internationalization, and wider cultural impact after her death, but also her influence on other writers. Translators and biographers fascinated with her words and her experiences, not to mention archivists, literary critics, and researchers of all kinds have pursued the woman and the meanings of what she wrote. Her works and image have been revisioned in different media, film, theatre, dance, fragmented or caricatured. Here's an example of a book for children, a biography for children called Clarice Lispector, for boys and girls, for girls and boys. But an example of the sort of caricature of her image. And she's been circulated on social media. There's a chapter on memes, which is fascinating. She's been co-opted for a self-help agenda. How Clarice Lispector can change your life. And she certainly changed mine. And how she's been used as the inspiration for new literary creations, après Clarice. For many readers, the impact of their first encounter with the writer and the intimacy her work seems to represent, a watershed moment in their lives, marking out the periods before and after Clarice. We, the editors, have brought together a deliberately diverse and eclectic range of scholarly articles, works of fiction and poetry, personal essays, and archival material in order to reassess how Lispector's wide-ranging oeuvre is read today. Many of these contributions developed in the months following an international conference on Lispector that we co-organised and which took place in November 2017 here in Oxford. Magdalena was present as well. So this is a kind of reunion that we're having today. And the conference, also called After Clarice, commemorated the 40th anniversary of Lispector's death. But it also aimed specifically to analyse her legacy and influence as it has developed in the decades since. So she's not really dead. The volume highlights the fluctuations and swerves in Clarice Lispector's critical fortunes, focusing on the way her works have circulated through translation into other languages and genre and media and cultures. Our conference was committed to reaching out to international scholars and translations working in non-Western languages, for example, Israeli Hebrew and Mandarin. We also wanted to acknowledge the ways that Lispector is read beyond academia, reflected here in the inclusion of poems, personal essays, and song lyrics. And some chapters venture beyond the grave, literally, in the case of Giovanni Pontiero's lost translation of The Besieged City, and more figuratively in Magdalena's discussion of Lispector's only TV interview. Any consideration of Lispector's legacy builds on the work that has come before, and this volume would not exist without the studies and translations and creative reimaginings of her work that preceded our own investigations. And the structure of the book highlights one of various ways of reading and interpreting her legacy. For ease of navigation, we've divided the volume into 7 parts, each part consisting of interrelated chapters. But I won't go into that. I think I'll stop there and hand over
And then
to
I'll bring it,
Adriana.
yes, I'll bring it home, as it were. So then after going through the chapter breakdown, which as Claire has already read, is quite a diverse range of both genres and approaches to her Lispector's work, we close with a few sort of final reflections. So on December 10th, 2018, on what would have been her 98th birthday, the daily Google Doodle was dedicated to Clarice Lispector. It featured a collage by the artist Mariana Valenci, her granddaughter, who's also the illustrator of this collage on the cover. And we have these, the publisher gave us these sort of posters, so you're free to take one. Put this on your wall if you want.
This is where it
And it
came
comes
first.
from this book.
This book, which is one of her children's stories. And so you can see, I'll pass it round so people can have a look. It's beautiful illustrations.
Yeah, so Valenci's collages of her grandmother contain a number of references to her literary texts, but also in Valenci's words, represent her epiphanies coming from everyday scenes. And this collage is one of several that Valenci created about her grandmother, and then we were grateful that we could include it in our conference poster and in this volume. The collage we selected brings together flora and fauna of Brazil, the typewriter that Lispector preferred to hold in her lap as she typed. You can see pictures of her doing that online, and her interest in astrology and the occult. But we also want to call attention to the ship that's climbing down her neck, which, you can see it in that behind you. In Valenci's collages, the ship is a figure of immigration, a reference to the ship that brought the Lispector family from what is now Ukraine to the shores of Brazil. The ship appears to be moving out of the frame, but the full image reveals that it is sailing towards a keyhole at the base of her neck. After Clarice gestures to the future readers and scholars of Lispector, but it also recognizes the ways that our own thinking about life and literature have been shaped by her encounters with her texts. So many of the contributors can tell you the first time that they read Lispector, which exact text pulled them in. We're happy to share those stories if you wish to hear them during the discussion. On December 2020, Clarice scholars around the world were marking the centenary of her birth in a wide range of media and genres. The many commemorative events, launches, exhibitions, film premieres, and publications were held in places as far afield as Princeton and Macau, and they had to adjust to the challenges of a global pandemic, but still went ahead adapting to new formats. And our birthday present was an online preview of this volume, which reunited the contributors to the book in virtual form, since it was not possible for us to celebrate in person. But I also just want to close by saying that for both Claire and me, working on this volume together during the pandemic was also an act of deep friendship, but also I think of intellectual survival, but may also explain something of the piñata effect that it has. So I'll end there and then pass it over to Magdalena, whose chapter on performance, I should also say, at the conference, you also performed your own sort of piece, a Lispector-inspired piece. So the chapter brings together your own direct experience as an actor, performer, writer, and then Lispector's own performance in the interview that you're going to describe. So,
That's right.
Yeah.
So happy to be here. Adriana, Claire, thank you so much for having me. Patrick, it's so lovely to meet you. fellow actor and rabble-rouser. You can tell we're going to have so much fun. We are having so much fun.
That's for later.
I also thought this morning about what I'm wearing. Clarice Lispector was very in tune with the visual and with performance, and I've written a lot about how her work as a writer and as a translator, she herself translated into Portuguese from English and French, and she what am I wearing? It reminds me of, so I was born in Chile, in Santiago, during the dictatorship there. And then my parents moved. My mom is here. She's in the front row. She's an economist, and she's also speaking at Oxford later this afternoon. It's so fun to be in cahoots, actually. So when I was little and we would go to Chile on occasion and I would be sent to school there, I would have to wear a delantal, like an apron. And this annoyed me to no end. I did not like being told what to do. But the good thing about the delantal is can be a sign of play. You're going to put it on, you're going to paint, you're going to get your hands dirty, you're going to explore. And I think Clarice invites readers to do that. And she invites us to get into the creative. And when you bring up the après, the after, I think about conversations I've had with fellow Clarice translators, such as Katrina Dodson and Idra Novi and many others, about the after of translation. We end up with this extra energy, this extra creative energy. What do we do with it? And so Clarice is a very generous writer because she gives so much to us as readers and she gives so much to us as translators. We have this after effect or this aftermath or this afterbirth, and then we use it for our own works. Idra is a novelist. Katrina writes lyrical essays. She just translated Macunaíma, which is a major work, and I've done performance and other things. So I'm going to read a tiny bit, like 4 minutes, from my chapter. And Adriana already mentioned, I was invited to do a performance lecture. And what a wild and lovely and generous invitation. So I thank you both for that. It was such a magical time, that conference in 2017. So my chapter is called The Body Speaks, Clarice Lispector on Screen. In November 2017, I presented a performance lecture titled The Body Speaks, Clarice Lispector's The Chandelier at the After Clarice Lispector's Legacy Conference in Oxford. This work required me to play several roles, including the translator of O Lustre, which I am, the translator of that novel, the main character of the novel, Virginia, and the author herself, Clarice Lispector. I was terrified to attempt to transform into Lispector, even if for a moment. How could I dare? I watched her 1977 interview with Julio Lerner numerous times as part of my preparation. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was practicing a new way of engaging with Lispector's work. The essay that follows is an attempt to put my experience into words within a format that accomplishes the analytical and argumentative task of academic writing while maintaining the spirit of reading that Lispector recommends in her conversation with Lerner. Reading that is motivated by feeling and entering into contact with Lispector. As she says to him on screen, either it touches you or it doesn't. So the first section of my essay is called Lispector on Screen, Speaking from the Tomb. And this idea really is that she speaks to us from afterlife, and she has prepared a message, actually, I think, quite purposefully. On the 1st of February 1977, Clarice Lispector filmed her only television interview, a conversation with TV Cultura's Julio Lerner in São Paulo. The camera is on Lispector, who sits smoking in an armchair with an ashtray to her right. And she smokes throughout the interview. And I should say, you can Google her name, look at videos, and it'll pop up right there. It's, I think, one of the most fascinating things I've ever watched in my life. So I recommend those of you who haven't seen it yet to watch it sometime today if you can. Lerner is off camera, such that when she speaks to him, she is looking toward, but not directly into the camera. The image is framed in a way that gives the interview an intimate and detached quality at the same time. The viewer watches Lispector watching Lerner as he asks each question and sees Lispector get caught up in her own storytelling and train of thought. And it should be noted, too, I get into this later in the essay, she falls asleep during the interview, and they keep the footage in there. And so you have this very strange, evocative, provocative moment that I think I could write a whole book about. So I hope someone does that one day. Her final words to Lerner on camera, which end the filmed conversation and respond to his question of whether she is reborn or renewed with each new work she publishes, are, "Well, now I died. Let's see if I am reborn again, for now I am dead. I am speaking from my tomb." Her dramatic statement reiterates her earlier declaration during the interview, where she says, "I think that when I do not write, I am dead." The declaration is hyperbolic, an exaggerated affirmation of how the act of writing is primordial for her. It is a testament to her sense that if she is between projects and not in the midst of the creative process, then she is not truly alive. And how many of us feel that way, who have some kind of artistic practice? And don't be shy. Let yourself think about that. Maybe you're a musician of a kind, or a writer, or a cook, a chef, a person. We are all artists, really. So when we're not practicing that thing that makes us feel alive, right, how do we feel? Her repetition of this idea at the end of the interview, "I am speaking from my tomb," also functions at first blush as hyperbole because clearly she's in the television studio being filmed. On the day of filming, Lispector asked Lerner to promise the interview would not air until after her death, and he agreed. Lispector would die of ovarian cancer without knowing she had the disease because her doctors had not told her on the 9th of December 1977. The interview aired on the show Panorama less than 3 weeks after her death on the 28th of December 1977 at 8:30 p.m., and the final footage is under 23 minutes. On the night of Lispector's television debut, and each time her interview has been viewed subsequently, her words, "I am speaking from my tomb," perform and enact what was only metaphorical on the day of filming. And so as my essay goes on, and I'll stop here, I put her interview in conversation with, among other things, video art made by Brazilian artists during this time of dictatorship. A lot of them are women artists who are making these kinds of films and clips that they're not distributing through the television, formal, censored distribution channels. And it's very, very interesting because Clarice was, of course, a writer, and she was also a practitioner of other arts. And so now we have the chance, and this volume really reflects this, to uncover and to play with and to be fed by all of this work that she made.
Thank you very much, Magdalena and Claire and Adriana. What came out from those presentations, and most notably from Magdalena's presentation, was what I mentioned earlier when I was presenting the event, that strong vein of creativity which this particular writer seems to call forth from us. And talking earlier to Claire, Claire told me about how when you work on Lispector, you develop this sense of intimacy with her. And I noticed that you all called her by her first name. And so when I was walking over here, I was thinking Lispector, but I was hearing today Clarice, and I wondered what it was, and perhaps we can think about that because I think it probably goes to the heart of the way she writes and the way she is received. What is it that makes one feel so close to a writer that one can call them by their first name in one's head, in one's imaginative engagement, and so on? I know for my part that I would never do it to Flaubert. I would never dare to call him Gustave. I would just about manage to call Proust Marcel, but that's because he does it himself. There's a kind of permission being given in her writing, which I think a lot of writers don't seem to give us. And I wondered if that could be perhaps my first question to all of you, really. Because it's also a response that I had both to her and to hearing you talk about her, which is the kind of real feeling that brings academic discussion alive.
Do you want to start?
Yes, I mean, in Portuguese and Brazilian literary criticism, there is a convention to refer to a lot of writers by their first name. So it doesn't come as such a shock to me to do it. And I've been reading her for a very long time by now, and I do feel like I know her in multiple ways, although there are other things which will always escape. And this feeling of intimacy, I wonder if it's something to do with the ambiguity of how she writes. and how that opens up her writing for readers to bring their own experiences to what she's saying. I mean, the feelings that she describes are things which I didn't know I'd felt. It's almost like she creates a new kind of vocabulary for experiences and feelings and moments that that I, once I'd read them, I recognised them. And this is something that makes it quite difficult to translate, the ambiguity of what's happening in her sentences, of her language.
Yes, I would say you're right, spot on about that, especially in O Lustre, the chandelier, where it's very much about this creative process and this process of feeling and sensation. And she really does take us along. She says over and over again, instant by instant, right? Moment to moment, feeling something through. And her character, Virginia, it is a Bildungsroman or an anti-Bildungsroman. So it's kind of like this growing up novel where this girl child is going through all of these things. She doesn't even know what they are. And we're there along for the ride with her, feeling them through. To your question, Patrick, I love your question. It's so delicious and juicy and makes me think of new things. So here's what I'm going to say right now. I'm going to throw down and I'm going to say, and this comes also from my conversation this morning with Ling Chen Huang, who's writing her dissertation on Clarice. She's very dynamic and elastic and creative in what she's doing. I think Clarice Lispector is a secret or not so secret musical artist. And we must call her by her first name, like we do Betania or Maria Betania, the sister of Caetano, like we do Shakira. If you haven't caught up on Shakira breaking the internet, please do after this talk. Or Beyonce, or my current obsession, Rosalia, who is an artistic genius and does a lot of syncretic things. So Clarice, yes, everything that you say is absolutely true. And when I first went to Brazil, I was almost a little uncomfortable. We got to call her Clarice because I was writing all my essays until then about Lispector. But then everyone there does it, so you feel okay to do it too. And now it's been so many years. But Clarice is a musician. I mean, she, in A Hora da Estrela, in The Hour of the Star, in the prologue, she tells us who she's dedicating this book to. And it's all these musicians, from the classical composers to the electronic musicians, right? And this thing has 13 titles, and so it's kind of this multi-chord situation. And then O Lustre, the very first sentence, ela seria fluida durante toda a vida. She would be fluid or flowing all her life. And we talked about that this morning. We had a delightful cafezinho. And that first sentence is so musical. It's like she sets you up to participate. And this brings me to Maria Librangi's work on the oral novel or the listening novel, right? Clarice grew up in an immigrant household with many languages. Like, she wants to tune your ear to her novel, O Lustre, the chandelier, to her musical composition. Ela seria fluida durante toda a vida. I wrote a whole thing about how do you translate this into English? I mean, this sentence is doing so many things. Right? So I'll stop there. But yeah, I love this question.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's so many ways to answer it. I think one way I'll answer it is that that I did not come into this project as a specialist. That's Claire Williams is really knows Clarice Lispector's life and work inside out. My field is modern Hebrew literature. My languages are English, Spanish, and Hebrew. But I encountered The Hour of the Star in Giovanni Pontiero's translation in my undergraduate course, as you'll recall, the world novel, which was taught by Kirsten Silva Cruz. And this novel just changed my life. First of all, because I just had never seen a novel that was that short. It's more, I think we would call it a novella. So in terms of its form, in terms of its content, everything about it, the language, it just completely excited me. But that novel also begins with an affirmation that everything begins with a yes. And this is, I think, for a young woman in Southern Virginia college, it was a deeply powerful message that I have carried with me in all the years since. But I also really, I think, embraced because I came to this project because I love Lispector's work. I've read her work both now in Hebrew and English translation. When I met Claire, I just saw this opportunity both to kind of return to this author whose work has been so meaningful to me, but also to get out of my comfort zone. I think that academic careers are built on specialization. So we're supposed to become really good at something and become experts at it. And I love the idea of joining this project with Claire and not being an expert. And letting that kind of lead me to new ways of doing my work and my writing. So the chapter I ended up writing on the Hebrew translations of Clarice was very much influenced by the contributions we were getting, including Magdalena's essay. It's not the kind of work that I've written before. So I think in that sense, also, this became a very personal project for me that helped me figure out kind of where I want to go next in this career that I've sort of been on for quite a while. So
That's the advantage the editor has, of course, that they can shape and calibrate what they are contributing to their own book of essays
yeah.
as things come in. I was struck and I was moved by something that you mentioned, both of you, when you were speaking, Claire and Adriana, but you also mentioned it in your introduction, that it is also an act of friendship, isn't it? And I think that that extends into the book itself, which really is a meeting point and a melting point of different ways about thinking, not just about literature, but about art and the arts and the ways in which they interconnect. And I think maybe my choice of the word piñata was misplaced in that sense, but I was thinking more in terms of a meeting place of different languages and different ways of responding. A truly, for world literature, which Lispector is, I haven't yet graduated to calling her Clarice, maybe I will by the time this ends. We also need a world criticism, don't we, or a world kind of openness to criticism. And one of the things that both of you mentioned as well were the fluctuations and the swerves in her reputation. And you talk about that in your introduction. And I don't really know about those. For me, she arrives fully formed as a classic of world literature. And I have no idea, and maybe the people in the audience also don't have any idea of how she got there, as it were. Could we discuss that for a brief while?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in her lifetime, she did not achieve the fame and the recognition around Brazil that she has now, and certainly not so much international. She was being translated already in the 60s and 70s, and she died in 1977. She was more of a kind of an acquired taste, known to professors, known in academic circles. For her novels, but she also wrote in the press. There's quite a lot about her journalism and her interviews and her writing for women's pages, which surprises a lot of people who think that she's this feminist writer, and yet she's writing about. She started out writing, publishing in order to earn some extra money on recipes and how to dress and how to bring up your kids and how to get stains out of clothes and that kind of thing. She started publishing these short stories and text in the press, and then she travelled with her diplomat husband after publishing her first novel, Close to the Wild Heart, which had a massive repercussion. It was celebrated in Brazil, and after that she had to live up to the success. But she'd moved abroad, so there was a kind of a tension there. And while she was living abroad, she kept one foot in Brazilian publishing by publishing in the press and publishing short stories. And then she returned to Brazil in 1959 and started publishing again. She became more known to the everyday Brazilian by writing crônicas, short kind of opinion pieces, every Saturday in the Jornal do Brasil, one of Rio's most popular daily newspapers, and that gained her more of a readership. So she had fans, as it were, or readers on different levels. So those who read her every Saturday, but didn't necessarily like her novels, which were a bit introspective and philosophical, and those who loved the the psychological, introspective novels, but not necessarily the opinion pieces. And then after her death, her last two novels are slightly more metafictional. They're short, very fragmentary, and metafictional, and they brought critics and academics became more interested in her work, looking at those last two. Another phase of her popularization, internationalization, was when the French critic, feminist critic Hélène Cixous, wrote about, chose her as one of the proponents of écriture féminine, feminine writing, along with James Joyce and a lot of other very well-known writers. But she chose this almost unknown in European circles, Brazilian writer. And then we could also talk about the translations, how they into so many different languages, and how they have popularized her work around the world, and particularly since the New Directions and Penguin translations of almost everything. I mean, that's something we wanted to find in the book. We wanted to find things that had not been published, and it was quite difficult to do things that hadn't been said before, and we tried very hard.
I love everything you've said. And it's so here, when I first read Clarice in Chile, I finished Harvard. I'm the first person in my family to go to college in the United States. I come from a long line of university students and graduates and stuff, but I was the first one to go to school in the US. So I graduated from Harvard, and then instead of like joining Google or something, like a lot of my classmates did, I moved to Chile and became an ESL teacher. And my dad was very bewildered. And I was like, well, I have to go do this. I have to explore my roots, and I have to be with my cousins and my grandparents. So when I was teaching ESL at an international high school where I got this job, I read Clarice. I read Giovanni Pontero's The Hour of the Star, because the English teacher who was teaching IB, International Baccalaureate, was teaching this novel. My mind was totally blown, just as you described. And I didn't know what to do. I found this new North Star, and so on and so on. Then I started grad school at UCLA. I did a PhD there in comparative literature. And I took intensive Portuguese for Spanish speakers. Quarter 1, Quarter 2, Quarter 3, I took a seminar on Lispector. Summer, I got some grants and went to Rio for the first time. Everyone had something to tell me about Clarice. The taxi driver, the restaurant person, the Brazilian friends I emailed ahead of time. Oh, I'm going to hook you up with my mom's professor from PUC-Rio, So I showed up, not only with numbers and emails and meeting people who studied her and so on. Everyone had something to say about her. I mean, everybody. And then I had occasion to go to a conference in Jerusalem right before COVID, and there was a Brazilian scholar who gave a paper on Clarice being taught in schools in Brazil. So she's been part of the curriculum, in the school system there. So of course, New Directions has done a kind of brand new packaging of Lispector on the global stage. And her son is very involved in that, and so that's a very interesting thing too, the legacy of a writer in the hands of family. Very interesting when we talk about Mariana Valenti's, I love this piece, and I just saw Lucian Freud's exhibit in London, and of course he's the grandson of Sigmund Freud, so just to even think about putting grandchildren together who then have a new praxis and are kind of working through. So I've now lost the thread, the answer that I'm trying to give, which is actually what Clarice wants. She kind of, I feel, wants us to sort of get lost and discover new things. And I love what you said about not being an expert, because I think a lot of her writing too is about being uncomfortable. So I think she's always resisting being packaged or pinned down. No matter what any of us might want to do, if we want to make it tidy, if we want to make it complete, if we want to translate all the things, no, there are things that have not been translated because no one has seen them yet. I've heard about them in Brazil. There are more things. There are letters that haven't even been published in Portuguese. So she's a Pandora's box. Well, she's a Clarice's box, really. She's not a box, but yeah.
I'm happy to weigh in and also
Weigh in, please.
No, I think the other thing we try to do in this volume is also think critically about this category of kind of world literature and where she fits into it, or even her status as a world writer. And so I just want to quote very briefly, Idra Novi, who's a poet, translator, novelist, wrote a wonderful series of poems, Clarice the Visitor.
I was
And
going to read those.
please, okay. No, I won't read the poems.
Oh,
You can
okay,
still
good.
read
I
them.
was
Yeah.
going to, yeah.
No. So, but in her preface, she writes, Clarice doesn't belong to any of us. And I think this is also an important thing that I've tried to hold on to, along with this idea of, Clarice feels like she's speaking directly to me. She's speaking directly to me. She also doesn't belong to me. And so I think with the repackaging, for example, we have a critical chapter here on her reception in the Anglophone world, which, and all the ways that Anglophone becomes problematically synonymous with world. And the way that translation into English then also shapes reception in the Brazilian context in ways that are also kind of a little tricky. And then in the chapter on the Hebrew translations, I addressed how, The Hour of the Star was translated into Hebrew and published in the late 90s. And it, according to the publisher, the Hebrew publisher, it didn't do very well. So he didn't really follow through commissioning other translations. Then Benjamin Moser's biography happens, New Direction resets the translations, and suddenly there are like 4 new translations into Hebrew, including a reissuing of the Hour of the Star translation. And that's interesting to me, all these different sort of processes. But I think while, the initial reaction I have to this is, oh, this is wonderful, she's appearing in Hebrew, the scholar in me also steps back. I guess this is where, the academic training kicks in and is like, wait a minute, yeah, what's going on here? What are the potential pitfalls of this kind of global attention? What gets missed? Who gets marginalized and erased from this process? So that's something I think the volume also tries to kind of.
Yeah, and one of the things I was going to, which you segued me into, was what you were saying about how very often the big term world literature is really a way of smuggling in a kind of Anglo-supremacist view of how literature reaches us. Thinking about Lispector as a world writer and so on, I was most struck when I began reading the book about the section about places and maps, which gave a kind of granularity to the places she lived in and wrote about. And I'm conscious of that in a city like Oxford, which very often feels like it's not a place really, more a kind of 3-dimensional postcard that we happen to be living in. And I thought reading these contributions about the place, I got a really satisfying sense of concreteness. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what it is that anchors her to her particular time and place. We've understood in a way what makes her ongoingly interesting and interesting to so many of us in different disciplines. But what's the kind of the heavy bit, that stops her floating away?
What is like the marrow of it, or the
I guess,
core?
or the anchor, or
anchor?
the specificity, and also because she travelled so much and drew in so much from so many different places.
I think her clarity on the blurriness of being a stranger in a land is really appealing to us today, because there's something about, I think, her experience, not to reduce her, any artist or writer, to their biography, but she was born in one place where a lot of terrible things were happening. The family had to escape, and then she grew up in this other place. And then her mom passed. They were first in the northeast of Brazil, but then her mom passed when she was little, and her dad moved her and her sisters to Rio for more opportunity. She was one of the first women to go to law school in Brazil. She married a diplomat. She then quickly had to become a citizen. Then they go back to Europe. There's something about her sense of not being totally comfortable where she is and navigating that I think we as readers in 2023 can really relate to. And I think what's really, really interesting and generous of her in a way, and she was almost like a thinker avant la lettre, is that she maybe understood how we now have to contend with the virtual and maybe even with artificial intelligence. There's something about that uncanniness. And Elizabeth Lowe, who knew her, who's written about her, who has an interview with her where she talks about going to Clarice's apartment in Rio and sitting in her living room. And her living room is filled with paintings on the wall of Clarice by different artists, de Chirico, others. And I keep thinking about this and wanting to stage it as a play even. And it's like her living room is a proto Instagram gallery, right? And I don't know if any of the paintings or photographs she did herself, like as a selfie, but just even the way she contends with image, her own image, performance. In her very first novel, Joanna, this little girl, is playing with little figurines while her father is typing clickety-clack on the typewriter. So her father's writing, she's playing, and she's playing all the characters, and she's also the director, and then one of the little characters gets run over by a car. And then that's like foreshadowing O Lustri and A Hora da Estrela. So I think that's the anchor of it, maybe, is the storytelling and the narrative, which is the thing maybe that gives us an orientation or a caminho, a path, even when we're lost. Yeah, I think that might be part of it.
Yeah, she's constantly inventing. She's constantly questioning language as well, and playing with language and turning verbs into nouns and nouns into verbs. And I mean, that's not a constant. I mean, that is a constant, but it's not a reduction to a definition. That's one thing she does continuously, and she's also she provides the outsider's point of view, but she's also looking at identity and like the Bildungsroman, how a being feels in space, psychologically and geographically, and observing. It's very pictorial, very visual how she writes, as well as very the level of the language as well, playing and inventing. And I think each of her texts, although we can see foreshadowing, each of them is very different. She's constantly reinventing form and questioning form, and how people write, how writers write, and how readers read. She's kind of challenging us all the time, because we get used to reading in a certain way, and then she does something which we've never seen before, like the 13 titles. We think, what's going on here?
Well, that takes me actually very nicely, before I invite people to speak, to the poem I was going to read, which Adriana mentioned, by Idra Novi, because what you were saying about turning verbs into nouns and so on, and the constant wrong footing, the productive wrong footing of the reader. And I thought these poems were so clever and so deep, and also so generously minded towards the person they were writing to, which is also what I liked about this book. It was as if you were at some level writing to Clarice. Finally, I've called her by her first name. This is the poem, Dear one of a sequence. Dear C, I'm turning from, have been syntaxed and stirred into a purple, blurred to blind. I made a mess of page 22, couldn't resurrect what you left unsaid into words that wouldn't. Do you believe in grieving? I mean for language, the endangered animal of fleeing into caves. I can only keep after it in fits, or I get trapped in the keeping after. That and bliss, your spinning but devoted IN. I thought, I mean, this is criticism, but it's also, it's poetry, it's engagement, it's taking something that existed before and making a new thing, which is what this book has done in all its many moving parts.
Perhaps I can just talk about Idra,
Please.
she translated The Passion According to G.H., which is one of the perhaps most hermetic novels by Clarice Lispector.
Which I have here in Hebrew, if anyone wants to see the Hebrew translation of this extraordinarily challenging novel.
Yeah, and so the poems came out of that experience of the difficulty of translating it, which it took some time to translate.
She had 1 year to do it. It was a crunch.
But it did. But she turned the experience and the difficulty and the challenges into these beautiful poems.
Yeah.
And describing how Clarice was like a visitor in her life, who sat down with her at the table and played with her children at the same time, And she also wrote a comic novel, which is quite interesting to anyone who's learning Portuguese, because she talks about because it's the main character is a translator who's translating a canonical Brazilian author, although they are very much a remove from our Clarice and our Idra. But she talks about little tricks that she's invented to translate certain Portuguese things. So that's just to show how the experience of translating had to brought off these offshoots, these kind of spin-off extra energy that we were talking about earlier, that you're talking about with the after effects.
Yeah.
That you can't, she fuels you in a way that you need to do something more.
Yes, I mean, I think you're onto something, and it's also interesting, this idea of an ache or a yearning or and that feeling. I mean, she's so about feeling. And when you were talking about language, I mean, Lispector is really like a sculptor, and the main character, Virginia Nolustri, she makes these figurines out of clay, or like an architect, like anyone who works with materiality, with materials. Someone who does couture, who does fashion, or who does sewing. I mean, she's looking at language on a level of materiality, and the materiality of sound, of shape, of feeling, of rhythm. And so I think that in that regard too, she almost hypnotizes us into letting go of meaning as we understand it on a logical level, and letting us go into feeling or taking in. That's why she says in the interview, either it touches you or it doesn't. Either you feel it or you don't.
Yeah, we have a chapter on mistakes in this book, which is really wonderful, by Yael Segalovitz. I, I appreciate that you read this particular poem, because my comment about the anchoring would have been, which I'll offer now, is that I think that there's always a mess in Lispector's writing, in her stories. And that's something that for me has been the anchor. There's at some point, whether it's language or the characters' relationships, or in The Hour of the Star, the way Macabea is eating hot dogs is really messy. There's always something messy. And I find this, again, so deeply affirmative. And it's just like, and especially working on this during the pandemic, this became at times, I would say, it was a messy process, but we forged through. But it was also a messy time, and I think so. I'm not surprised that she ends up in self-help books or providing self-help, because I think there's something about her work that, for me, the mess of it has kind of somehow found its place at different points of my life. And so again, going back to the intimacy, I think that's always been something that's kind of fundamental to her writing. And I don't know many. I mean, there are other writers who sort of allow for it, but there's a consistency to Lispector's embrace of mess and creation of it, that I think is anchoring.
Yeah, often that can be the plot, is that there's a mess. And that is the plot, basically, how the subject deals with the mess.
Yeah.
Psychologically, philosophically, coming to some kind of resolution. That's a very good question.
Great question.
I mean, there's one answer which is to do with language and the way that we study literature through language areas. And is she Latin American or is she Brazilian? So, and is she part of the boom, or were the critics who were writing at about the boom literature unable to read Portuguese and so left her out of their studies? Or is it because she was a woman? I'm not going to answer that, but I think there's something in the language, there's something in the fact that she was a woman, and that she was not part of a school in Brazil either. She was great friends with a lot of writers, but she wasn't part of a movement. And I think the fact that she changed her writing regularly was part of that as well. And whether we have to study her in isolation. A lot of people compare her to a lot of other writers.
Yeah, I mean, I would say very quickly, one thing that's very interesting to me when I lived in Chile and then when I lived very briefly in Brazil and have visited many times, the publishing industries in Latin America are not interconnected with ease, which I kind of had assumed they would, of course, be, and they're just not. So not only is that the case, but Brazilian Portuguese and Latin American Spanish, which of course differs not only within across countries but within countries, you know, there is not a synergy that you might think looking from the outside that there would be. Brazil is a gigantic country. It's as big as the US, and it has many different cities and dialects and cultures within. But there is already kind of those things aren't talking to each other as much as we might think they would be, if that makes sense. And I think reading her alongside other writers, as a comparative literature person, it's always great to juxtapose. She herself liked to play a lot of games, and she would get interviewed and say, well, have you read? Oh, no, I haven't read anyone. I've never heard of Kafka or Proust or Joyce, never. She was an incredibly intelligent, sophisticated, well-traveled, well-read, multilingual translator from other languages into Portuguese kind of person. So, you know, I leave that to you to decide. But I think that juxtaposing her is a very productive thing, and I hope there's more and more of it.
Thank you. I'd like to squeeze in that one last question that you were going to ask.
Well, I think this goes back to performance. I think she was very aware of how she fashioned a public image. But I have no doubt that in the privacy of her home, she was in Uggs and some heavy coat and, but I think whenever, there's a camera or there's someone in an interview or something, like she was very aware of the performative aspect of being sort of a public facing writer. But it does create then, when you read her works and you have there's so much imagery about her that circulates, including these false Clarices that Katrina Dodson writes about. And that's also another story. So we have all these images of her looking like so polished and made up. And then these works that are, right, the celebration of mess as far as I read them.
There's definitely a Clarice iconography doing the rounds, isn't
and
there?
it's interesting to think about,
But look at her final, look at her only filmed interview.
Right, well, that's a different...
Because that, I think in a lot of ways she let go. I think the fact that she asked them not to release it until after she passed is a very specific choice.
Thank you all very much. I'd like to thank Torch for organising this, the audience for coming. I'd like to thank Adriana and Claire for being such good colleagues who I knew already, and Magdalena, who I've just met, for being such a fantastic visitor to Oxford. This has been a fascinating discussion, and this really is a wonderful book, which is a homage in many ways in kind to a unique writer. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.